All right. Good evening, everyone. As I just mentioned in the chat, if you could please leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. We love to hear where everyone is tuning in from our events. And otherwise, my name is David Palco. I am one of the co-directors of Jane Austen and Company and a PhD student in English at Duke University. I'm joined tonight by my co-host, Abilene Christian University Assistant Professor Eric Bontempo and Delta State University Professor Emeritus Susan Allen Ford. Our technical director, Nadea Pugh, is an undergraduate student at UNC Chapel Hill, majoring in English and comparative literature. UNC Professor Inga Brody is also one of our co-hosts this season, and each event will be hosted by a combination of the four of us, sometimes joined by a guest host or two. Tonight is the third talk in our new series, The Many Flavors of Jane Austen, when we hear from today's most creative and engaging adapters of Jane Austen's works. In our last event, we heard from C.K. Chow, the author of Good Fortune, an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice set in early 2000s Chinatown. C.K. had fascinating thoughts about the role of place in Austen's work and her own. So if you're not able to attend, please be sure to check out the recording of C.K.'s talk, which is available on our website, www.janeaustenandco.org.
And please remember that our website also contains all of our previous lectures. There are over 40 lectures on topics ranging from music and Jane Austen to representations of race in the Regency to the science behind the Regency practice of sea bathing. It's been such a delight to bring you this thought-provoking programming for the past 3 years, and we aim to continue to do that. Our spring series coming up is going to be all about Austen versus the Brontes, and we're kind of hard at work planning what comes next for Jane Austen and Company. So far, we've been thrilled to maintain a pay-what-you-can model because while donations are very important to what we do at Jane Austen and Company, we recognize that not everybody is in a financial position to give. If you are able, though, to donate, please consider donating on our websites or through the link that we're sharing right now. We want to keep this programming as widely available as possible, and donations are how we're able to do that. So even a few dollars would make a big difference. So thank you sincerely for all of your continued support. Oh, and let's go ahead and get started now. So I'm going to turn things over to Susan, who is going to introduce Sayantani.
Yes, it's my pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Sayantani DasGupta. Sayantani trained as a pediatrician and is now a teacher in the master's program in narrative medicine at Columbia and the graduate program in health advocacy at Sarah Lawrence. She's written a memoir, Her Own Medicine, A Woman's Journey from Student to Doctor, as well as a book on Bengali folktales with her mother. In addition, Sayantani is a New York Times bestselling author of 3 critically acclaimed middle grade novel series, Kiranmala and the Kingdom Beyond, The Fire Queen, and Secrets of the Sky. The first of the Kiranmala and the Kingdom Beyond books, The Serpent's Secret, was a Bank Street Best Book of the Year, a Booklist Best Middle Grade Novel of the 21st Century, and an E.B. White Read Aloud Honor Book. The Kiranmala series is inspired by Bengali folktales. The Fire Queen series is inspired by anti-colonial ideals, and The Secrets of the Sky by environmental themes. Sayantani is also the author of the chapter book for young readers, Virginia Apgar in Chelsea Clinton's She Persisted series, as well as 2 wonderful and engaging Jane Austen-inspired young adult novels, Debating Darcy and Rosewood, A Midsummer Meet Cute, which I've just given to my high school age niece. And I had to kind of do the fangirl thing before we started and just gush about how wonderful they both are. Sayantani is also a team member of We Need Diverse Books. For those of you who haven't yet read Debating Darcy and Rosewood, A Midsummer Meet Cute, we're posting the Amazon link to her Jane Austen adaptations. And before Sayantani begins, our technical director, Nadea Pugh, is going to explain how you can send in questions during our conversation.
Thank you so much, Susan. Hi, everybody. Welcome to YouTube, our streaming platform. If you'd like to leave a comment or ask a question, please use the comment feature on the sidebar. Sayantani may answer some questions throughout the presentation, but otherwise your questions will be collected for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You will need to log into your Google or YouTube account to be able to post there in the sidebar, but if you do not have a YouTube or Google account, that's okay as well. You can just submit your questions to info@janeaustenandco.org, and I'll post the link or the email in our chat. And you can just send comments or questions there, and we'll collect them and ask them for you.
Thank you, Nadea. And without further ado, here is Sayantani DasGupta.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I want to thank Susan and David and Eric and Nadea and Inga for generously including me in your community. It's just such a delight to have known about, but now really felt the warmth and kind of intellectual embrace of the Jane Austen communities across the country, including the wonderful Jane Austen and Company. And so I'm really just so pleased and humbled to be a part of your important conversations. And so folks, if you don't know about their wonderful Jane Austen and Company's kind of wonderful library of lectures, please do go look them up. I have been really digging into them and enjoying them and learning so much from them. In case anybody is trying to find me, I'm actually no longer at Sarah Lawrence. I haven't been there for a little bit. I'm full-time at Columbia, but I do teach in the narrative medicine program there and in 2 other undergraduate programs, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. So that is where I am, but I am here tonight in my hat as a YA author of 2 Jane Austen adaptations. And the title of my presentation today, so Nadea, yes, exactly, is Subversive or Submissive, Diverse YA Tellings of Regency Tales. And so again, I am at Columbia University for my academic job, and most of the books that you heard Susan so kindly describe are from Scholastic, except that book about Virginia Apgar is a Penguin Philomel book. So let's go ahead and start with slide 1. Great. It is a truth universally acknowledged that everyone loves a good Jane Austen remake. From Alicia Silverstone's Clueless to Bowen Yang's Fire Island, so the top and the bottom images there, a gay, mostly Asian American Pride and Prejudice, to the forthcoming Netherfield Girls starring Maitreyi Ramakrishnan of Never Have I Ever fame, Austen's stories of love and courtship in 19th century England continue to shape our modern day ideas of romance. Slide. Dakota Johnson's portrayal of manic pixie dream Anne Elliot notwithstanding, see or don't see the recent wink wink nudge nudge, aren't I such a wacky lady remake of Persuasion at your own risk, Regency romance appears to be just the soothing balm our pandemic-battered collective psyches need. Now, for those of you not familiar with the manic pixie dream girl trope that I just referred to, it was coined by film critic Nathan Rabin in 2005 to describe Kirsten Dunst's character in Elizabethtown. Rabin said that the manic pixie dream girl exists solely in the fevered imaginations of sensitive writer-directors to teach broodingly soulful young men to embrace life in its infinite mysteries and adventures. But I digress. Back to Austen. Go ahead, next slide. As a Vasey Austen lover myself, I'm particularly thrilled at the wave of color-conscious casting of Austen and other Regency Tales. From Shonda Rhimes' delicious Bridgerton and Queen Charlotte series to Emma Hawley-Jones's Mr. Malcolm's List, which stars not only Frida Pinto in the romantic lead, but has her love interest played by another person of color, Sophie Dirisu. And the reason I point this out is that it is honestly just so rare, even in these color-conscious castings, to see two people of color play in kind of romantic partnerships with one another. So like the Bechdel test, which is often used to kind of gauge whether or not two women in a film talk to one another and not about men, I like to say that I coined the DasGupta test for rom-coms, in which both partners are people of color. So sorry to say, they are still few and far between. Go ahead, next slide. It very well may be that this recent Regency romance obsession is linked to our endlessly depressing news cycle and a need for escapism and happily ever afters. Yet, the Desi community, and when I say Desi, I mean South Asian diasporic communities, so Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, etc. So the Desi community's longstanding love of Austen, I would argue, certainly predates the pandemic, and is perhaps related to the fact that, like the cultural focus on courtship and marriage in Austen's novels, South Asian community life often centers around marriage. Next slide. Austen's quaint village churches may be light bedecked wedding halls, simple gowns of white satin or lace may be transformed into opulent Banarasi saris, and the carriages of Darcy or Knightley may become transfigured into horses and elephants. But the importance of marriage as a meeting of two families, a meeting of communities that's documented in Austen's novels is, of course, thriving and well among many South Asian communities throughout the world today. Even the Indian film industry, interestingly enough, seems obsessed with creating Austen remakes. Next slide. From the 2000 Tamil-languaged Kandu Kondian, which is a Sense and Sensibility revisitation, to the 2010 Emma-inspired Aisha, to, next slide, London-based director Gurinder Chadha's 2004 Bride and Prejudice. There have been a huge number of filmic adaptations of Austen's works. There also seems to be a real popularity in adapting Austen among Desi YA and adult novelists as well. Next slide. I'll just give a shout out to the wonderful Sonia Kamal and her unmarriageable Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan, as well as Sonali Dev's series. Dev's series, Pride, Prejudice, and Other Flavors, being the first, I believe, in that series. Next slide. To Aisha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin, Polite Society by Mahesh Rao. Next slide. And of course, my own contemporary YA novels, which I'll be talking more about tonight, Debating Darcy and Rosewood, A Midsummer Meet Cute. Debating Darcy is a more true to the text Pride and Prejudice adaptation, whereas Rosewood is a looser Sense and Sensibility meets Shakespeare meets Bridgerton romp of a rom-com. And here's a little secret. Next slide. I also have a short story written a long time ago called Samosas and Sensibility in a collection called Bad Austen, which has some wonderful works in it as well. Next slide. And of course, when I go around to schools around the country talking about my Austen adaptations, I make sure to remind them that part of the reason for this kind of international multicultural love of Austen is that Jane Austen belongs to everyone, as exemplified by this gorgeous online image. And I think, you know, the plethora of Jane Austen groups, including, next slide, Black Girl Loves Jane with Damian Scott, who I believe has been here at Jane Austen and Company, is but one of kind of these many Jane Austen groups, which shows how broadly kind of beloved Austen is. And of course, when I go on these school visits, I make sure to point out, next slide, the humorous parallels between Austen and other international phenomena like K-dramas. So here we have a couple of memes, which I did not make, but my high school students I visit seem to enjoy them. The first one says, how K-dramas are like Jane Austen novels, sassy poor heroines with a heart of gold. And the second one says, how K-dramas are like Jane Austen novels. And they have kind of two brooding Mr. Darcys, Matthew McFadden, and then a K-drama Mr. Darcy on the left. Next slide. This is my favorite. How K-dramas are like Jane Austen novels. Everything is great until the meddling relatives show up. And there we have one of my absolute favorite characters on the right, Mrs. Bennet from the 1995 BBC miniseries version of Pride and Prejudice. Next slide. So in terms of my personal relationship with Jane Austen, I was introduced to Jane Austen G, or Jane Mashi, Jane Auntie, by my mother during one of my many long summer vacations to Kolkata, India. We would travel from our home in Ohio and later in New Jersey to spend the 3 months of my school summer holidays with our extended family. And the school systems, the school years being slightly different, I was often alone. My cousins would be off at school during the days. And those afternoons were long and hot. But my book-loving grandfather's dusty bookshelves were stacked 3 rows deep with the world's best literature. And so once I had finished, let's say, all of the Nancy Drews or whatever I had brought along with me, I would dig into those shelves. And despite being a once jailed Indian freedom fighter, my grandfather's collection did lean heavily toward British literature. As a Desi friend of mine is fond of saying, even our literary tastes and our imaginations are colonized beyond repair. 200 years of British rule will do that to a people. But all jokes aside, it was on one of those long summer vacation trips that my mother first handed me this cover, this particular version of my first Austen novel, Pride and Prejudice. And I'll tell you my first reaction when I saw this book. I looked at the cover and I looked at that image and I thought, this is not for me, right? This is not for girls like me. Because of course I look nothing like the image on the cover. And then, of course, it came into my mind that my mother was giving me this book. And I started to look for more kind of other secret reasons she might be giving me this book. And so I read the title and I thought, my mother is trying to teach me a lesson. Don't be proud. Don't be prejudiced. And so for a while, I really thought that this was some kind of didactic lesson that my mother was trying to teach me. But boredom won out. I opened the book and I was entranced. So despite that initial resistance on my 12-year-old part, very quickly, Austen's timeless story of 5 unmarried sisters managing friendship, love, and the rigid rules of society captured my imagination, giving birth to a lifelong obsession with all things Austen, all things Regency, all things romantic. Next slide. Since then, I visited all of Austen's novels at least once a year, maybe Mansfield Park less so. Sorry, Fanny Price lovers out there. I have visited it multiple times, just not every year. If it was courtship and romance that initially drew me to Austen's work, as it does, I think, for a lot of young Austen readers, what's kept me coming back, and I think I must share this with a lot of Austen fans, is Jane Austen's famous wit and her razor-sharp ability to use humor as a tool of social critique. So sentences, right, whiz by our eyes like swords. She kind of dissects people's behaviors, community mores, with kind of this lighthearted wit. And that's what keeps us returning back. It certainly is what keeps me returning back. And in reimagining Austen for a contemporary teen audience, it was this quality I wanted to capture. Next slide. I wrote adaptations of Austen as YA novels to recapture some of that delight and joy I felt when reading Jane Austen for the first time as a young person. And of course, like anyone writing an adaptation, I began with the original stories, but I then made them my own. For my Pride and Prejudice adaptation, I wanted to reflect the way that in Austen's original, Elizabeth and Darcy, our protagonists, verbally spar as a love language, right? They debate their way into falling in love. And so Debating Darcy is set in a contemporary high school setting with my Lizzie character as a scrappy high school debater and my Darcy character as a wealthy, more entitled debater from a private school, right? I wanted to still capture some of that class conflict. Whereas in the original novel, Lizzie and Darcy verbally spar during country dances and society balls. In Debating Darcy, those dances are transformed into speech and debate tournaments. Regardless, however, of if it's a dance floor or a debate round, intellectual and emotional sparks fly. But while Austen uses humor to examine gender roles, classism, and unfair inheritance laws, I turn my eye to gender, class, yes, but also colorism, colonialism, racism, not to mention bringing a Me Too consciousness to that slimy sexual predator, Mr. Wickham, in my Pride and Prejudice reimagining. I wrote Debating Darcy, interestingly enough, without a contract. I was actually under contract for several other books, but it was during that first terrible 2020 winter of the pandemic. And I wrote Debating Darcy because I needed to read it, right? I had always dreamed of adapting my favorite novel so that I could see myself in it, but I'd never had the courage, right? I was always worried if I could really live up to the challenge. But during that winter, I really needed the book enough that I took the leap. And I wrote this book, next slide, in answer to Toni Morrison's powerful admonition. If there's a book you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. This is a slide I always share with students when I visit schools. And I actually wrote it for, go ahead, next slide, all the brown girls who dreamt of gossamer gowns, only to realize we were already wearing crowns. And for Colin Firth, for reasons that I hope are obvious. And I thought I'd actually read you here the author's note as well, just to give you a sense of why I wrote the book. Dear reader, it is a truth universally acknowledged that Pride and Prejudice's Lizzie and Darcy are among the most iconic examples of enemies to lovers couples. In Austen's original 1813 novel, the pair bicker, fight, and debate their way into falling in love. So it made perfect sense to me to set my modern reimagining in the ultra-competitive world of high school speech and debate tournaments. This is a novel that celebrates the power of finding your community and speaking your truth, even when it's scary. It's a novel about knowing we are all worthy of taking up space in the world. In between the wit and banter, the complex debate topics and funny musical theater references, it's ultimately a story about justice and honor, friendship and love. So, dear reader, whether you have, like me, read and watched versions of Pride and Prejudice a zillion times, or really never heard of it until now, I hope you find power, laughter, courage, and joy in these pages. Because words matter, art matters. Debating the issues that affect our lives matters. Your voice matters. You matter. And love, in all its beautiful romantic and non-romantic derivations, matters most of all. Next slide, please. So with my second adaptation of Austen's work, Rosewood, A Midsummer Meet Cute, I began with the sisterly pairing of Elinor and Marianne Dashwood. But I soon found myself wondering how much Austen's two sisters of different temperaments were akin to other literary sisters, in particular, Katerina, Catherine, and Bianca from Taming of the Shrew. And that's when this book became as much about Shakespeare as it was about Austen. So I was a big theater kid in high school. My own children were in a children's Shakespeare troupe we have in our community from grade 4 to grade 12. So Rosewood is a bit of a love letter to those over-the-top, fabulous high school theater kids, the ones who live for drama and dream big, the ones who create community for each other, even when some of their identities place them at the margins of mainstream high school society. I'm a huge fan of Shakespeare, as I just said, but particularly of summer productions of Shakespeare's work. And I wanted to give Rosewood that giddy midsummer feeling of seeing Shakespeare outdoors, right? Fireflies dancing around the actors' heads as they deliver beautiful soliloquies. And the fact that my sisters, Malika and Ela, in my adaptation, are attending a summer Regency camp that is scouting extras for a Bridgerton-like television show was a tribute to kind of the campy spirit of adaptations like the film Austenland. Next slide, please. So just to do justice, oh dear, that slide is rather unclear. I'll read it off of here. I'll also read you the dedication and author's note of Rosewood. So because this is a story about two sisters actually dealing with the death of their father and the different ways in which they both deal with it. The older one by becoming more responsible, more controlled, more kind of unforgiving of herself and more unforgiving of even her own youthfulness, and a younger one who kind of embraces life and embraces joy and frivolity and ridiculousness. I myself, being a firstborn immigrant daughter, dedicated this book for all my fellow firstborn immigrant daughters. And then I have 3 quotes thereafter. Give a loose rein to your fancy, indulge your imagination in every possible flight. Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice. Awake, dear heart, awake. Thou hast slept well, awake. William Shakespeare, The Tempest. Oh, you and your rules. Kate Sharma, Bridgerton. And I thought similarly, I'd also read you a bit of the author's note for Rosewood. For many years, my midsummers have been full of magic. There's nothing more I enjoy than going to an outdoor Shakespeare performance and being transported into an imaginative world far greater than my own, a world of kings and fairies, lovers and villains. It's the same transformative feeling I get when I lose myself in the novels of my favorite author, Jane Austen. I wanted to infuse this romp of a story with all the midsummer joy and giddy firefly romance I feel when I see outdoor theater. But I wanted to cast it with the same inclusivity that color-conscious directors are using to transform Regency adaptations on the small screen. I wrote this story because representation matters. Because no matter our ethnicity, sexuality, background, or body, we all deserve to see ourselves as beautiful, magical, and desirable. I never did as a little brown-skinned immigrant daughter, but I vehemently want a different, self-loving, happy ending for all my own children, and all those younger people coming up after me. For this world to be a fair and just place, our stories must center us all as protagonists, heroes, and love interests. I hope this tale sweeps you into a world of dreams and fantasies from which you will awake transformed. Because now, more than ever, books make things fictional so that they can be made real. Stories help us dream new worlds we would imagine into being. Let this new future we are creating together in story and in practice be more just, inclusive, loving, and true. Let us together dream such a world into being. Let us awaken from our dreams and fight for it. For love is always, always enough. Radical love and joy can be revolutionary. So next slide, please. What are we doing when we cast Jane Austen adaptations, or any Regency story for that matter, in a color-conscious or sexuality-conscious way. In other words, what does it mean to re-envision an all-white and an all-seemingly heterosexual novel with BIPOC and queer contemporary characters? Am I a brown-skinned immigrant daughter who never got to read about or see characters like me in novels and films, simply reclaiming those beloved stories as my own, declaring, as I said before, that Jane Austen belongs to all of us? Or am I actually letting those stories off the hook from a deeper critique, ignoring their oppressive aspects in their very recasting? This is one of the many arguments in Debating Darcy between rival high school debaters Leela Bose, who's my Lizzie Bennet, and Feroz Darcy, who is my Pakistani British American Fitzwilliam Darcy. Instead of arguing about Austen, they actually argue about Lin-Manuel Miranda's BIPOC cast play about the life of Alexander Hamilton, the musical phenomenon that arguably set the stage for our current spate of color-conscious Regency stories. So Leela, my first-person narrator, begins like this. The thing is, it's just that, oh no, I'm sorry, excuse me, that's not Lizzie. This is my Feroz Darcy who says this. And so Darcy begins like this. The thing is, it's just that, I mean, to be honest, I don't like Hamilton. Everyone seems to think it's so edgy. Darcy had his legs crossed, ankle over knee, and his fingers tented under his chin. In actuality, it's just a weak apologist play that lets a bunch of racist enslavers off the hook, makes them seem palatable and cool. Did you read that hot take on social media, or did you come up with it yourself? I snapped. I mean, we were talking about my favorite play here. What kind of a monster didn't like a clever hip-hop musical about America's founding fathers? Ooh, Thomas Jefferson couldn't have been a rapist. The guy who plays him is hot, and he can rap really fast, Darcy said in a scornful voice. The guy who played Thomas Jefferson was really hot, but that was beyond the point here. It's a legendary moment in musical theater history, I said, in which brown and black folks get written into the story of America for once, in which we get to see ourselves as the protagonists. Why do we need to co-opt the majority stories and insert brown and black faces into them? Shot back Darcy. Why can't we just write our own? Why can't we do both? I demanded. We've been silenced for so long. Can't we find multiple ways to express ourselves, speak, and have our voices and stories heard? Even though Jane Austen's novels were written before the official beginning of British rule in India, I worry if basic adaptations of her stories can be accused of distracting from more critical readings of her work and its relationship to colonial rule, right? We see that in Mansfield Park a bit. On the other hand, they might give permission to young Austen fans of color, like I once was, to see themselves more fully in her work. Rather than offering any firm solution to this tension, I've chosen to let my novels actually just sit in it, having my characters themselves reflect on this push-pull problematic between representation and critique, co-option and adaptation. Interestingly enough, Gurinder Chadha, next slide, also grapples with this tension in Bride and Prejudice. And I'll just give you a few examples here of how she resolves it. The Lizzie character named Lolita in her film is Indian, and the Darcy character is an American hotelier. And she critiques his business policies and ultimately multinationals altogether. Darcy says, don't you want more jobs, more opportunities? And Lolita says, you want people to come to India without having to deal with Indians. Isn't that what all tourists want? 5-star comfort with a little culture thrown in? Well, I don't want you turning India into a theme park. I thought we got rid of imperialists like you. Next slide. They also get into it about arranged marriages. Darcy says, I just find the whole arranged marriage thing a little strange. I mean, 2 people getting married who don't know each other. It's a little backward, don't you think? Whereas Lolita says, Americans think they know the answers for everything. including marriage. Pretty arrogant, don't you think, seeing how they have the highest divorce rates in the world? Next slide. Gurinder Jadha even has Darcy kind of heavy-handedly critiquing India altogether, saying things like, the computer system keeps crashing, the electricity goes, I don't know how business is run here. Next slide. And in fact, she has, in this adaptation, she has her Lizzie character, Lalita, drawn to Wickham because he sees and appreciates India for what it is. Wickham says, or her Wickham character says, that's the greatest thing about living in India. You don't need money to enjoy it. In fact, if you have money, you don't see the real India. I feel like people have their priorities in order. And over the course of the film, next slide, it's only when Darcy learns to appreciate India also that we can have the big kind of coming together, the big marriage scene at the end, and we get our happily ever after. So it's only actually through a kind of, arguing through and resolution of these kind of colonial, post-colonial conflicts that happily ever afters are possible in Gurinder Jadha's vision. Next slide. So in my other Austen adaptation, Rosewood, A Midsummer Meet Cute, this is set in a summer Regency camp, which is, as I said before, scouting young multicultural extras for a Bridgerton-like television show. But what that did, setting it up in that way, gave me the opportunity to engage directly in the tensions of color-conscious casting. So in my adaptation, we have, yes, the two main characters as well as the two sisters, but we also have kind of a larger community around them, a group of brown and black, queer and straight theater kids attending the camp who have multiple conversations about this very issue, demanding at one point that there be more queer representation in the novel's titular show, which is called Rosewood. Ela Das, the Eleanor Dashwood stand-in and protagonist, the older sister, enters the camp's imposing mansion setting in the same way that she and her fellow actors seek to enter the world of Regency stories. She says, we had just made it to the top of the red carpet and into the cool marble-floored foyer beyond. I could see a throne-like seat at the end of the room and the sea of nervous teenage courtiers in between. Ornate marble columns dotted the long space, and there was a balcony from the second floor all around. There were gilt mirrors on the high ceilings overhead, and on the walls, giant paintings of old white dudes on horses and reclining white ladies in fancy gowns being fanned by children of color. What am I even doing here? I muttered, not sure if I was more annoyed at the gross paintings or at Rahul, who's the love interest. I mean, I had relatives who died fighting for freedom from the British Raj. Rahul looked around, then at me. Remember, it's all pretend, he said. Think of it as a subversive act. How Queen Victoria would squirm to see two brown ex-subjects like you and me here doing this. For a phone-thieving rake, at least you have a sophisticated understanding of imperialism, I muttered. Next slide. When I was young, I never got to see myself or anyone vaguely like me in the stories that I loved. This lack of representation convinced me at some deep level that someone like me was not worthy of being seen as a hero, a love interest, or a protagonist of an epic tale. And if I was not worthy of being represented as a hero, maybe someone like me couldn't be a hero even in the story of my own real life. If narrative erasure is a kind of psychic violence, maybe the sort of multicultural representation we see in recent Regency romances and Austen adaptations can be a kind of medicine, a storied healing for those of us who have too long been ignored, erased, or vilified. Or maybe, as Ela's love interest Rahul notes, it can be a kind of subversive act, a representational thumbing of the nose to those who kept our ancestors barred at doors declaring, no dogs or Indians allowed. As Ela's free-spirited younger sister notes in Rosewood, We can take what we want from those bygone times and leave what doesn't suit us. Is a brown Eleanor Dashwood or a Basie Mr. Darcy enough to heal all our psychic wounds, post-colonial, representational, pandemic-related, or otherwise? Of course not. But it's a beginning, a start of a new sort of literary and historical imagining in which we all belong, in which we are all celebrated, in which we are all heroic and worthy and centered. Alongside the publishing and film world's greenlighting more original stories by marginalized creators, the reimagining of traditionally white Regency romance with BIPOC and queer characters is a way to breathe new life into those old stories, entering them with fresh eyes and possibly revolutionary perspectives. As Regina Rivera Colon, Rosewood's Shonda Rhimes character, declares at the beginning of the novel, not all of us growing up were allowed to dream of beautiful things. Not all of us growing up were allowed to think of ourselves as the protagonists of the story. But all of us deserve to be a part of the fantasy. All of us deserve to celebrate the magic that has always been there inside ourselves. Thank you. That's it for me. I am happy to turn it over to our questions.
That was wonderful, Sayantani. Thank you so much. And people in our audience, please start posting your questions. Thank you. One thing that struck me when you were talking is that when you said that you wrote Debating Darcy during the pandemic, is that last week C.K. Chow said that she wrote Good Fortune during the pandemic. So here both of you were thinking about Pride and Prejudice and during the same moment and coming up with the same thing. Do you have anything to say about that? I just think that's pretty fascinating.
I mean, I feel like for so many of us, so in general, I think we turn to stories and familiar stories, and we reread and we rewatch, and we re-enter familiar stories. I think as kind of a deep medicine, as a deep kind of form of comfort, as a deep form of intellectual and imaginative healing, right? And so for many of us, that, and I think that the stories that we all enter may be varied, but for many of us, it's Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is the story that we re-enter when we need to find ourselves again, or we need to kind of heal, we need to settle in, we need to kind of put down the difficulties we may be facing in the world. And that time was such a time of stress. And so I'm not surprised at all that many people were turning to reading or watching Austen adaptations. I think it's kind of delightful that many authors were also writing Austen adaptations in the moment, kind of writing ourselves into a more healed consciousness, right? I think that's delightful.
Well, it also strikes me that, I mean, there's a whole kind of tradition of thinking about Austen therapy. And, going back to people reading Austen during World War I and then again during World War II. And so this reading it during the pandemic, but also then writing these adaptations seems to be a new version of that. It's just fascinating.
No, I mean, it even came up in the Barbie movie, right? She made that joke that of course, everyone then poked fun of me about, where Depression Barbie was like watching 1995 Pride and Prejudice for 75 times in a row, or whatever the joke was. But I think there's a grain of truth to it, in that I think there is, kind of a cultural community making in re-entering, either rereading those stories or rewatching your favorite, adaptation or what have you.
Yeah.
1995 all the way. I will not be taking arguments about this.
Okay.
No, but I'm free. I welcome arguments about it.
Well, speaking of arguments, I think I mentioned to you backstage before we started that I was on the debate team when I was in high school. I was on the forensics team, and it was so pleasant to kind of go back into that world when I was reading Debating Darcy. And I loved, like, in your second chapter, you have to put this like parenthetical in when you talk about forensics, and it's like, no, not the criminal science. We're talking about the world of competitive speech and competitive debates. And your truth universally acknowledged of, like, there are two types of forensics kids: competitive speech and competitive debate. Is so true. You typically only see one or the other. I'm a weird, rare exception, but like by and large, two very distinct social groups in that high school setting. How fun was it for you to, I don't know, explore that world? Where did that backdrop come from? I'm just kind of curious to hear more about that.
I mean, I was a high school speech competitor, so competitive acting. And for those of you who are in it, we're all like, of course, competitive acting. Those of you who have never heard of it are like, what? Like, people did this? Yes, it was competitive acting. It's a big part of my growing up. I was not a debater, but I really wanted this book to have them debating, because I felt like those balls were really, I mean, in the book, they're dancing, but they're really verbally sparring, right, the entire time. So I wanted to create that situation of verbal sparring. So I wanted them to be debating. So I had to do a bunch of research, re-enter, contact my old friends who were high school debaters. I had like sensitivity readers, but for debate, read the novel, make sure I was getting the debate stuff right. And then, really interestingly, because I was entering, I was doing a lot of research about current day high school speech and debate, I stumbled on these kind of anonymous social media sites where young, usually women, were posting about sexual harassment and kind of gender discrimination and kind of inappropriate behaviors in the speech and debate world. And there were other similar anonymous sites for other kind of high school communities. But to me, it was both so sad that this was happening, but also so powerful that young people had found these spaces to raise their voices and speak truth to power and speak kind of their personal experiences to one another, with hope of both healing and kind of stopping these behaviors. And so I really, when I stumbled on this actual community now, I realized that it was kind of also a perfect way for me to explore how my 2022 or 23 heroines would handle a situation like Mr. Wickham in the speech and debate community that Austen's 1813 heroines couldn't. There was a lot of anger, there was a lot of frustration with Lizzie towards Wickham, but certainly that wasn't a situation where you could kind of call him out for perpetually perpetually being inappropriate to 15-year-olds. So I kind of loved the fact that there was a way for me to explore that. I hated the fact that this was happening to these young women, but I was also so impressed and proud of them for creating a space of resistance. Even within like my beloved speech and debate world, like we want to make it better, right? We want to make these spaces welcoming for everyone.
And as a follow-up, I think we have a question from the audience, like self-knowledge that Lizzie has to achieve. Do we see that in Debating Darcy in your adaptation, like this quest for self-knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love Lizzie's arc, and I mean, there's such beautiful, right, transformational arcs throughout the original Pride and Prejudice. And in my adaptation in Debating Darcy, Lizzie's kind of transformation both has to do with seeing my Darcy character, for who he is, but it's also, she has a kind of second transformation where it comes to Lydia. So in the original, who doesn't detest Lydia when they originally read Pride and Prejudice, right? It's just like, this selfish girl, like, what is she doing, jeopardizing her entire family? But when I was rewriting it, I kind of had a reawakening of my relationship with Lydia. And I realized, well, why would we shame a 15-year-old girl for kind of behaving in these ways? And why wouldn't we want to make sure that she was safe despite her kind of being jubilant and, kind of emerging into her own sexuality or what have you? And so Lizzie kind of has to have, she's very angry with the Lydia character at the beginning of the novel. And she almost has like a feminist awakening to Lydia, where she realizes, she's like, oh no, it's not Lydia that's the problem, it's society that's kind of telling her that she can only behave in certain ways that's the problem. So she both has a kind of awakening vis-a-vis her understanding of Darcy, but also her understanding of the other young women in her life. So that was really fun to rewrite. Because it was taking a character that I actually detested and really examining my own feelings about her and realizing maybe I was in the wrong about Lydia.
Well, I think that was so interesting because, a lot of the contemporary adaptations of Pride and Prejudice are more sympathetic to Lydia and more protective about Lydia, but you did something else. You made her a hero. I mean, she was, she became this kind of person who stood up and went undercover, in a way to reveal who Wickham was and to reveal the dark side of this world. I mean, so she becomes something in your novel that I found really amazing. Can you talk some more about that?
Oh, thank you. No, I really think it was, me, like Lizzie, or like my Lizzie character, realizing that we perceive young women who behave in certain ways, as inappropriate, or, there's the phrase of slut shaming, right? We kind of see them as being in the wrong when in fact they're simply kind of being themselves, and it's the kind of constraints of society around them that are the problem. And so I think I was apologizing to Lydia Bennet by writing Lydia Rivera. I was saying, Lydia Bennet, I'm so sorry, you got the short end of the stick, and you lived in 1812 or 1813 or whatever. Situations were such that this was your fate. But Lydia Rivera, in 2023, your adapted avatar can have a different outcome. And so in a sense, it was that I had detested her so much, and that I realized, I kind of had to look back at my own dislike of a literary character and realize that it was rooted in politics that I actually don't agree with. And so it was me kind of as an author having to overcome my own prejudices. And I think that led me to giving Lydia a kind of heroic turn at the end of Debating Darcy.
And I'll add that I also loved the transformation of Lydia. So I will just add my thoughts on that. And I'll begin with a comment we have from a listener that I just wanted to say. I was in grad school before reading a fiction book where I said, "Oh my gosh, this could be me." So grateful you are offering literary mirrors, windows of possibility for people of a younger age. So
thank you.
Admiring listener who very much hears your message.
Yeah,
And
thank you. And I hope that, I don't think when we write adaptations, they're always ands, right? They're always read Pride and Prejudice and like, here's some other possibilities. And here's some entry points maybe for a younger reader, or maybe for a resistant reader like I was initially to Pride and Prejudice, who looks at the cover and says, that's not for me. nobody like me is in this book. This can't be for me. Well, maybe you read Debating Darcy first, and then you say, oh, okay, let me go back to the original. Let me see, let me see what this Austen is about. So that's my hope, is that these are multiple doorways back into this beloved text, but to allow new readers kind of different entry points that are inviting, right? As opposed to, like, I'm never interested in kind of a book or a piece of beautiful literature being a cudgel, right, on a young person's imagination, right? That's the surest way to make them hate something, right? Is to say, you must read this, it is good for you. Rather, can we invite them in kind of a loving and multidimensional way into multiple texts, right? And that's what I hope. That's what I hope. I am in conversation with many other authors, and that's what I hope we're doing, is just opening multiple doors into this beautiful world of Austen, of other kinds of literature that maybe they feel afraid to enter or feel unwelcome to enter. So that's what I hope we're doing.
And you actually answered the exact question I was going to ask.
Oh.
Yeah, I was thinking about Ela and Rosewood, and how she not only kind of finds her own voice as a protagonist, but also kind of comes into communion with Jane Austen's original text. And so you have this not either or, but both and, that you were just describing. And I was kind of wondering if that's what you also wanted for your readers, to be able to kind of have that relationship with the original. But I think you just answered it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I would love it if somebody was carrying around Rosewood and Sensibility and Taming of the Shrew all together and being like, let's see, what these connections are. Let's see what these sisters are about. No, I would absolutely love it. And so there's so much kind of self-referential stuff in all the books where the characters are reading Austen or talking about Austen or reading Shakespeare, or in the case of Debating Darcy, that passage I read. Here are two characters of color in a traditionally white story debating the role of characters of color in traditionally white stories, right? They're doing the thing that they're actually in. And so I kind of love that as a way to explore some of these thorny issues.
Yeah. I loved what you said during the talk about writing the book. Well, what Toni Morrison says, writing the book you want to read, but also writing the book whose story that you could be in, or that these other characters could be in. And I mean, I thought it was so moving, even at the beginning of Debating Darcy, that Leela wonders if she's worthy of being a protagonist, even of her own story. And there's so much, I guess, psychological depth to these characters, who, in both cases, feel so insecure. And I think that comes across with Elizabeth Bennet too, once we start to look at these other characters, these other adaptations of her, that they have this, well, in Leela's case, this inability to dance, right, or to speak in a way that taps into her own ideas rather than somebody else's voice. And it's similar, I guess, too, with Ela. Can you talk about your passion about presenting those kinds of characters and those kinds of problems? Because I think that really comes through.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I do think, I mean, I said it, I think narrative erasure is a psychic violence. So I think if you don't see yourself or anyone vaguely like you represented in literature, in the literature you have access to, or in the media that you have access to, or, kind of lauded as beautiful in the culture that you have access to, you internalize that deeply, and I certainly did. You internalize that messaging, and you say, well, therefore, not only am I not a protagonist. I'm hideous, right? Or I'm, unacceptable in this society. I should take up less space. And I think that, that's what, whether it's, kind of homophobia or racism or colorism, I think what they do is, for young people, there are these violent assaults on their psyche. There are these violent assaults on their self-consciousness, and their sense of self. And the message becomes, okay, not only, you're not being represented because you're not worthy of this representation, but therefore you must take up less and less cultural room. And so make yourself small, make yourself quiet, or behave in these ways. And that was the messaging that I got really clearly. And, not to be, too biographical about it, but that was certainly unlocked for me in these spaces like high school theater or high school speech and debate, where those are activities that are literally about voice and are literally about taking up space and are literally about being heroic. Those were also communities where lots of fellow marginalized folks, found home, and we found home in one another. And so I think in that way, they were kind of spaces of resistance, those communities for me. And there were spaces in which we were together able to recognize the social force, the structural forces, right? That it wasn't, I am not ugly. Racism, which is something outside of me, is ugly, right? I am not, I am not a terrible person. Homophobia, this thing outside of me, is a terrible force, right? And I think that is a really important thing for young people to learn, and to learn in community with one another. And so whether it was conscious or subconscious, one book is set in the speech and debate world, the other book is set in the kind of theater community. Both young women, both protagonists, are struggling with taking up space in the world, and by the end of each novel, do take up more space in the world. That really is a trajectory that I'm interested in. Like, I feel like, not to put too fine a point on it, but I do feel like children's and YA literature is responsible for making sure the young people of this world have space and have permission to use their voice and to take up, take up space, to call out the things that aren't serving them well and to embrace the things that are. And so I do hope that through my novels, I'm able to create that space. And then, of course, I'm talking about places that make that space, right, for my characters. But yeah, I do feel that so strongly. I feel that incredibly strongly, that, folks who are marginalized for various reasons need to come together in community, and in that community, find a new sense of self and a new sense of home, and reimagine a future together in which they're all welcome.
Yeah, and I think too, it's, I can think about my own experiences as a high school girl, and just, I think it's common for adolescents to think that it is better to make yourself smaller. It's going to be easier, you just don't want to do anything that's unlike anybody else. And so I think that's one of the reasons why your books are really so powerful, for even readers in their late 60s.
Thank you. As I was saying before we went on air, when you write a book in the pandemic, you kind of send it into the world and you don't know where it lands because you're not out in community with people. So I'm so touched, Susan. Thank you so much for saying that.
And my question is kind of related to this. And you talked earlier about Austen therapy, and YA therapy is also a thing where you don't have to be in the young adult category to read YA literature. My partner loves reading all kinds of YA, and I'm wondering, for you as a writer, are you finding that your books are being engaged with by younger readers and older readers alike? Do you have like a perception of like who your target audience is as you approach writing adaptations? I'm just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, so I'm mostly a writer of middle grade novels. So middle grade novels are that Harry Potter, Percy Jackson age, and I mostly write middle grade fantasy. So when it came to writing in this new age group, I'll tell you a funny story. For instance, my teenage children gave me a hard time about the lack of kissing scenes in Debating Darcy. They're more kissing, Mom. Where's the kissing? It was hard for me to kind of grow into that new kind of genre. But that said, I think that my both of my adaptations, although they're YA, are kind of meant for real teenagers, like 13, 14-year-olds, so often I think, and this is a whole different sort of discussion, perhaps for a different sort of a panel, what is considered YA now is often very much catering to adult audiences. And I think, I think it's great, and fine if adults read YA. What I think becomes a problem is when YA then, or the books themselves cater to an older audience and leave behind who they're really for. Like if a 30-year-old is reading a book, but that book is still really a comforting and appropriate place for a 13, 14-year-old, fine. But if something is being called YA, but it's really catering to a 30-year-old and not to a 13, 14-year-old, that's when we're actually, I think, doing a disservice to our actual teenagers. So much of the YA market has been driven by adults who read YA and who will ask questions like, oh, is it spicy enough? Or, and it's like, well, it's really for 13, 14, 15-year-olds. It's appropriate for them. So to me, it's really been an interesting journey, because what I'm realizing is, so there's that. And then there's the fact that kids read up. So actually what I find is it's middle schoolers. It's like 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th graders, who are actually the really appropriate audience for Debating Darcy and Rosewood. It's hitting well with them. They haven't yet encountered classes where, Austen is maybe being forced upon them. So they're brand new to Austen and they're like, wow, who is this Austen? They're delighted. And we've also not reached the age where, interestingly, I won't put a judgment on it, but interestingly, many like 11th, 12th graders I'm going to visit are like reading Colleen Hoover, reading books really meant for adults, which is fine. I read lots of books meant for adults, but so it's been interesting, both with the YA written for adults kind of issue, and then the kids tend to read up issue. So middle schoolers, I think, are really a perfect audience in terms of young people for Debating Darcy and Rosewood. And then there are the Austen fans like me, right? Then there are my contemporaries who have just been so generous and embracing of these adaptations. And there are people like me who will read every Austen adaptation out there. And so, I am in good community with many, many wonderful adults who have also been reading these books.
Yeah, and we would love to hear from people in the audience. If you have thoughts on this matter, please drop us a comment or ask more questions in the chat or email us at info@janeaustenandco.org. If you are thinking of questions, brainstorming questions or comments, we definitely want to see them. I don't know if this person is still in the audience, but we have one published YA author at least joining us this evening that I saw make a comment. So it'd be great to have a kind of conversation further about that. But thank you, Sayantani, for that question. David, did you have another question?
Yeah, and I'll also start again with another comment we just got in. I love the middle school books my granddaughter has shared with me, and also YA books like these two. It helps me remember what it felt like to be a kid. And that relates, I think, to what I was thinking about, which is very much connected to what you were just discussing with Eric and Susan. And I'm wondering about the idea of, since we've kind of focused in on these middle grade this middle grade audience, and what does that mean to you? What are you thinking about with that type of audience in mind, and how would writing for a middle schooler be different if you were writing an adaptation for an adult? What are the things that you change in order to make it appropriate for that audience?
Oh, it's interesting. I mean, middle schooler or high schooler, either way, I think we're focusing on, so as an adult, you have to put yourself back in those shoes and really focus on what developmental things are happening there, right? That separation from family and the kind of formation of your own identity and the struggles with friendships and kind of friend communities and that sort of thing. Teenagers are very much, suddenly forming identities away from their families and wondering how to make a mark on the world and who they are in the world. And those are questions that I'm really interested in. So as Susan said, I actually was trained as a pediatrician. So for me, kind of thinking about, being in community with young people is, kind of my happy place. And so I often say like, oh, when I was seeing patients in a clinic room, I was taking care of kind of their physical health, their corporeal health. When I teach in a classroom, it's their intellectual health. And when I write books for them, it's about their imaginative health, right? And so I really think that having books that reflect that sort of developmental dilemma of, okay, I'm changing, I'm differentiating myself from my family. What is the space that I will take up in the world? Those sorts of questions, I think, are questions for middle grade and YA audiences very much. And then, of course, I think, when YA books are catering to adults, they're grappling with more adult emotions and more adult situations, right? More adult romantic feelings. Not to say that teenagers don't have lots of romantic feelings, but they're different than adult romantic feelings, right? So, hi, Victoria. So I'm just seeing commenters who are friends. So I think that, being honoring and respecting and loving the audience is a big part of writing for young people. You have to love Jane Austen if you're doing an Austen adaptation. If you don't love Jane Austen, what are you doing, right? Like if you're not crazy about Austen, don't write an Austen adaptation. But if you don't kind of adore and respect, and I think the respect is a really important part of it, adore and respect young people. And have like a real deep sense of respect for their intellect, for their curiosities, for their hearts, then maybe don't write for middle grade and YA, right? Write for adults, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But I think that when the writing comes from a place of kind of deep love and respect for a community, that's when, it can approach, something powerful and authentic. And that's, the path that I hope that I'm on.
This next comment or question, I think, is one that follows from what you were just saying. So, as someone who writes across age categories, middle grade and young adult, what's something you love about being able to write about both of those, or write to both of those audiences?
I think what I was just saying really answers. Hi, Victoria. Really answers the question as well. This is Victoria, who's an amazing YA author in their own right. The other thing maybe I'll add is that the thing that adult authors don't get to do, they get to go to bookstores and do readings. They get to go to libraries and do readings. They don't go to schools. And the wonderful thing about writing for young people is middle grade or YA is you get to go to elementary, middle, and high schools, depending on what you're writing. Talk to students, talk to teachers, talk to librarians, look and see if your book is being used in parallel to a curriculum, in the curriculum, if it's being used as kind of individual reading in a classroom, whether or not kids in school are talking about those books, how they're interacting with them. So the wonderful thing is, adults, unless you're in a very active book club, we often read in isolation, right? We often read kind of in our individual homes or, in our individual minds, maybe having one-on-one conversations. maybe being in community in these sorts of spaces, right? Schools, you're constantly in community with fellow readers. And so you can interact about the book you're reading, about, a lecture you just had, about an author who just came in real time with other people. And that's kind of really delightful and exciting. So again, this idea of both of these books are about protagonists who are in community with fellow young people. And that to me is so exciting, because so much, I think, of my character's growth comes from the insights that their friends in community give them. And so it's really delightful to be able to go to schools and see that happening in real time. One kid say to the other kid, "I read this, you should read it, it was great," or whatnot. So the thing I love is being able to interact with young readers in schools. It's really a delight.
Can I ask a specific question about the Austen relationship with Rosewood? You were talking about, back with debating Darcy, how you felt sort of remorseful about the way you had felt about and thought about Lydia Bennet, as other people had. Did you have something, a similar response to Marianne Dashwood, or was she always somebody that you had a lot of sympathy for?
No, Susan, you called me out entirely. I had Lydia Bennet feelings towards Marianne Dashwood, right? I'm a first daughter, right? I am an Eleanor. I am the responsible one. I follow the rules and I get the things done, and I don't tumble down hills, and I don't go walking in the rain and get pneumonia, right? You wear rain boots or whatever, right? You do the responsible thing. So I, as a reader, over the course of my life, have had very similar feelings towards the character of Marianne Dashwood as I did, maybe not as much antipathy, but certainly kind of a sense of, this is a frivolous character. This is a ridiculous character. This is a character who's not learning the lesson she should. And in writing Rosewood, I fell in love with my Marianne Dashwood character. I love my Malika character. She initially, we perceive her through her sister's eyes. She seems all those things. She seems ridiculous and flamboyant and trying to get everyone's attention, and like a ninny, and, kind of a head full of balloons sort of situation. And she's not. She loves her sister fiercely, and she actually sees her sister's needs far more clearly than, the Eleanor character does herself. And she realizes, her sister's so deeply kind of ensconced in her mourning and in her fear that she's not just allowing herself to be young and live. And the younger sister kind of pushes her, Malika, pushes her, through shenanigans and scrapes and various situations, gets Ela, the Eleanor character, to a place of openness and to a place of love. And honestly, in writing that, I am far older than those characters. I think I was telling myself that. I was trying to teach myself that lesson of, what, it's okay. Like, let go. Like, you don't have to follow all the rules. Like, it's all right. Like, you can be joy. Joy is revolutionary. Joy is critical and important. And honestly, that's what, I have a pretty serious day job. I teach in this narrative medicine program. I deal with issues of kind of trauma and narrative. And, I think through really important, serious things. But I think what becoming a writer for young people has done is it's allowed me to go on Ela's journey, which is to remind myself, what, joy is critical, joy is revolutionary, joy is important. And give yourself permission. You will burn out, right, doing the serious work if you don't give yourself permission to be delighted and delightful, right? If you don't give yourself permission to be, to have wonder when you encounter a book, to, kind of interact with the world, with an open heart and kind of wide eyes. And I think that has only kind of helped and deepened my academic work. And then my academic work, of course, informs my creative work. But I'm really, really grateful to these characters for teaching me the lessons that clearly I, even in my, significant age, need to learn.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to ask a question about, I think it's really important to include minority identities, racial, ethnic, especially when it comes to adaptation. And I kind of wanted to know what you think about the difference between writing about those identities versus simply writing those identities. Do you think there's a difference, or is every story with minorities about being a minority?
No, I don't. I agree with you. I think that it's a question of subject and object, right? Is being South Asian, I'll use myself as an example. Is this book teaching others who are not South Asian about being South Asian, right? In which case it's a sort of a fictional textbook, if you will, right? Here are my customs and here are my belief systems and here are, right? And it's a kind of and this is a simplistic, slightly reductionist kind of way of describing it. But, I become an object, right, for other people to learn about, versus I'm a subject, right? Or the character is a subject who is doing things in the world and happens to be of one of many identities which are critical and important to how they interact with the world. Of course, right? They're not irrelevant. They're deeply relevant to how this person interacts with the world. But when I write these books, I write first and foremost for young people of color. I write first and foremost for queer young people. I write first and foremost not about them, So I'm not really interested, or I'm purposefully resisting a kind of voyeuristic gaze, and I'm purposefully resisting narrative expectations upon my community. And I'll give you an example of what those expectations are. So particularly, and I'll just speak for South Asians, when I wrote my first middle grade novel, which was a fantasy and adventure fantasy about a little girl from New Jersey who ends up being an intergalactic demon slayer, as one does, New Jersey, it's a strange thing. I was shopping this book, and it's kind of full of humor and love, and her family, even though they're actually her adoptive family, we learn they're her real parents, because they love her and they support her. And a lot of the feedback I got was, we love your voice, but could you maybe write a bit more about, her conflict with her parents, like her cultural conflict with her parents, because she's an immigrant daughter and they're immigrants. And the expectation was that I was going to write about oppression, right? That South Asian immigrant parents are necessarily deeply oppressive and deeply controlling. And I'm not saying that South Asian immigrant parents are all perfect or that problems in a community shouldn't be discussed, but when a certain expectation is the only expectation, right, I really feel the urge to resist it. I'm like, no, I'm not interested in writing that. That happens not to be my personal story, but also there's plenty of stories like that out there. Let's write a story, right? Let's write a story where these characters are not that. So I both am resisting kind of narrative compulsion that is often put on marginalized authors. And then I'm also really interested in my characters just being young people and being subjects of their own story, not objects there to teach someone else a lesson.
We have another question at the 11th hour from an audience participant that I think we can weave in and then kind of wrap up after that. So Cynthia Cox says, I love your Jane Austen adaptations.
Oh, thank you, Cynthia.
Do you have any plans to write any more? I was particularly impressed by the mashup of Shakespeare and Bridgerton and Rosewood. Do you have any other potential mashups in the works?
That's right. So nobody has bought it yet, but hopefully, Cynthia, call up all the editors and tell them to buy this. I've been working on, so I was a big fan both of Austen, but also of kind of Gothic. I was actually a fan of, not the Gothic novels that Catherine Morland reads, but kind of the Daphne du Maurier and, that sort of Gothic novel. And so I had this Northanger Abbey adaptation idea that was like a Northanger Abbey, Daphne du Maurier kind of mashup. Like, last night I dreamt of Manderley again, so that sort of a thing. Last night I dreamt of Northanger again. So I've been noodling around with that for a while. And then lots of my friends have been telling me Emma, just because of my sense of humor, and I do love to laugh. And so, as Lizzie Bennett would say. And so that one is just an idea. Certainly Emma at some point, but maybe a Northanger, like Gothic, Daphne du Maurier. Oh, or Mary Stuart had, not when she wrote the King Arthur books, but she had that whole Moon Spinners, My Brother Michael.
I love those.
Yeah.
Great.
If you haven't read them, read those books. So maybe a mashup with those. That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think we're all on board for when that comes out.
all the editors, no one has bought this.
Well, thank you so much, Sayantani. This is wonderful and so much fun chatting with you this evening. And thank you to everyone in our audience. Please stick around for just a few more minutes. We have some big news about our upcoming events that you can hear about. But first, we did want to share the website for Sayantani's author page, which is www.sayantanidasgupta.com/writer, which we are posting right there, where you can find her contact information, social media handles, and publication information for her work. And now I will turn things over to Eric to wrap things up.
Yeah, so thank you again, Sayantani. We have a couple events coming up. We're going to go on a break for the holidays, but we will be back on January 11th to hear from the playwright Sam Wright, who made an Oklahoma-style Austen musical. I have not seen this musical, but our fearless founding director, Dr. Inga Brody, has seen this musical, loved it, and definitely wanted to find a way to get Sam to join this series. So we're going to hear from him on January 11th. We will also in January hopefully be hearing from Uzma Jalaluddin. And then we'll be rounding out the Many Flavors of Austen series on February 6th with Siri James's presentation, Bringing Austen to Life on Page and Stage. And then after that, we are going to be kind of proceeding right into, or hopefully in March, with Austen versus the Brontes, which is going to be our next series. And so when we get reconvene on January 11th, we'll hopefully be able to kind of introduce some of our speakers for that series as well. But we thank you all for tuning in. Thank you again to Dr. Sayantani DasGupta for joining us this evening. And again, please consider donating to Jane Austen and Company if you are able. And we have this QR code on the screen, or you can visit our website at janeaustenandco.org/donate. All right.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Thank you again. All right. Have a good evening.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sayantani. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.